The hearing will reconvene, and we'll hear from Mr. Stern. Excuse me, Mr. Scalise. Ready? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looks like Mr. Schweiger has left. Is this gentleman, Mr. Koisjak? Is that your? Okay. Can you answer questions on? There was part of Mr. Schweiger's written testimony that I've got a big issue with is in relation to his claim that the deaths attributed to Hurricane Katrina the deaths from Hurricane Katrina are attributed to global warming. He actually attributes 1,800 deaths from Katrina to global warming. And I understand that he's left. I'm sorry that he's left because I represent a district that includes many of those areas that were hit by Hurricane Katrina and, in fact, incurred some of those deaths. And I take strong issue with the fact that he would attribute those deaths to global warming when, in fact, there is substantial record of documentation that both points out that global warming had nothing to do with Katrina's deaths, but in fact it was the failure of federal levees as well as the problems caused from coastal erosion. Now, what documentation, if you can speak for Mr. Schweiger, what documentation did he base his assertion on?
I'd be happy to speak for Mr. Schweiger. We didn't, in our testimony, state that global warming was directly responsible for that particular.
In written testimony, it's in his written testimony that he submitted right here.
There is certainly
on page
a link,
9.
and we made the link in the testimony between global warming and that storm because of the fact that there is extensive scientific data showing a linkage between the intensification of coastal storms and global warming. And so although you can never pinpoint one particular storm and saying that storm was caused by global warming, you could certainly say, as we did in the testimony, that a storm of that nature is becoming more prevalent in this era of warming. And I would defer to my colleague from NOAA to give you the citations to the papers, but there is extensive literature in this area.
I'll read his quote. Increases in weather-related disasters associated with global warming carry more than an economic cost. The perils of weather-related disasters are exemplified by Hurricane Katrina, which caused 1 million evacuees to flee and more than 1,800 deaths. Now, I would urge you to go and read the report by the Army Corps of Engineers, who acknowledges that the failure of federal levees is what led to the deaths from Hurricane Katrina, as well as the increased damage done by storms over the years due to coastal erosion, which at the state level, the state is working on restoring the coast, which is a very important issue for blocking future storms. But I would just urge you to spread that word back to Mr. Schweiger that I think it diminishes his credibility when he makes statements attributing deaths from Katrina to global warming to try to further his cause, because that had nothing to do with it. And if he's got some proof that carbon emissions had anything to do with the failure of those levees, tell him to get that information to the Corps of Engineers, because no one has ever asserted that up until this point. I see Mr. Lord Monkton nodding. If you had anything you wanted to add to that, Lord Monkton.
Certainly, sir, with pleasure. Mr. Justice Burton in the High Court considered this matter because, of course, Al Gore has also, in his sci-fi comedy horror movie, attributed the Hurricane Katrina to global warming. And Mr. Justice Burton, after hearing very careful evidence from both sides, including our own meteorological office, which tends to share the views of your NOAA over here, came to the very firm conclusion that that link cannot be established. And it's also worth recording that Hurricane Katrina was only a Category 3 at the point where it made landfall, and as you have rightly said, sir, the real failure here was the failure of the local administration, and I cannot for the moment remember which party it is, to make sure that the levees were adequately maintained.
The Army Corps of Engineers, which actually issued a report acknowledging that those levees failed in a way that they should not have failed for a Category 3. Following up on a point you made about Al Gore, because Al Gore has said on record that the UN is wrong and sea levels may rise upwards of 20 feet by the end of the 20th century. Do you prescribe to that view that Al Gore
I have recently consulted the world's foremost expert on sea level, Professor Niels Axel Mørner, who has written 520 papers on the subject. He tells me that sea level in the last century rose 8 inches, compared with an average centennial rate of rise over the past 10,000 years of 4 feet per century, and his best estimate is that it'll be another 8 inches now. The UN says perhaps 1.5 as its central estimate in the whole of the next century.
And I'm about to run out of time. One last question, Lord Monckton. Over the past decade or so, have temperature observations verified the model predictions that we keep hearing about?
No.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Alito, and myself. Mr. Carl, the Right Honorable Lord 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brinchley has told us that the Earth is cooling, which is an extraordinary statement given the unprecedented amount of scientific consensus to the contrary. I want to refer you to a slide showing 5-year averages of NIS, GISS data, and CRU Hadley data. These are, you have to look behind you to see it. I'm sorry, Mr. Carl, over to your right. These are 5-year averages that basically show a temperature in 5-year periods. Is it helpful to look at 5-year averages when we're looking at climate trends?
It's certainly helpful to average over longer periods than a few years. And in fact, I just want to point out that in the IPCC report, the reference to linkage between human contributions to changes in atmospheric composition and global warming was over the last 50 years. And there's a lot of danger in taking that record and looking at year-to-year variations and talking about cooling or warming.
Thank you. And my next chart, if we can put the next chart up, I think shows the wisdom of that basically shows annual temperatures, which does show the temperatures in 08 somewhat less than 04, but the trends are obviously disturbing, and I would trust the 2000 IPCC scientists. The next slide, please, showing observed monthly carbon dioxide trends as measured at Mauna Loa since 1973 compared with the emission scenarios of the IPCC will show that in fact the emissions, actually the concentrations in the last several years have been higher actually than even the models. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, next slide please. You can help me? You have a slide, it was the first slide of Lord Viscount Monckton. Yes. I was looking at this. I was intrigued by your testimony, Lord Monckton, and I was just wondering what this graph was.
That's merely the header sheet, so I know that the slides are up there. In fact, it's the view from my library in Rannoch.
Is this a coat of arms? Is that what they call this in England? Or?
No, sir. That is the portcullis, which is the symbol of the House of Lords, and superimposed upon it is the vice-comital coronet.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Lord Monckton, how much have the seas acidified since industrial times? By what percentage are there higher concentrations of the ions contributing to acidic oceans compared to pre-industrial times? I'll just take a number if you can give it to me.
Certainly, there has been no satisfactory measurement to establish it, but modelling suggests, and I don't know how reliable the modelling is, that the pH has reduced by 0.1.
And what percentage increase in ions? The scientists tell me that's a 30% increase in the ions concentration compared to pre-industrial times. And I'm a little stunned by your statement that there's no evidence in this. In fact, there's overwhelming evidence from multiple sources that our oceans are becoming more acidic, most recently off the coast of Washington State and Tatoosh Island, which showed the acidification caused by anthropomorphic, meaning us, putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, going into solution, and then making the oceans more acidic is actually accelerating even beyond the models, but it clearly is at extraordinarily high levels compared to pre-industrial times. Now, do you think that, given the value set that you bring to this testimony, considering that that can adversely impact living creatures, including corals and phytoplankton at certain levels, that that's something that we should make an effort to arrest?
No, sir, I don't think you need to, because if we go back a little bit further than the period you're looking at, and we go back to the Triassic era, where the most fragile of the corals first evolved, they were the aragonite corals. At that time, there was 6,500 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. One can presume, therefore, that there would have been more CO2 in the oceans at that time as well, and the corals did just fine. Indeed, that's when they evolved. So we know from these geological records that the fears over ocean acidification have been much exaggerated.
Well, your testimony is in stark contrast with the entire rest of the biological and botanical testimony. because you're talking about corals that were adapted to those conditions. We're talking about corals that are adapted to our conditions of acidity in the ocean. They are entirely different species. And in fact, it is shown by new research, so when you go back home, you can notify them in your country what we found in this country, which is acidification at certain levels, which we will approach in this century, retards the calcification and the deposition of calcium carbonate. That's a message for America, and just so you'll know, and we have lots of literature about this. I'd be happy to provide you. Thank you.
Without objection, sir, may I introduce into the record a recent book on the subject by Dr. Craig Idso, which is a comprehensive review of the literature on precisely this subject, and I think you will find that it does show a rather different picture.
Thank you. We enjoyed
portrayed. Thank you, sir.
Sure. We'll insert that in the record by unanimous consent. Mr. Call, do you want any comments on ocean acidification, what NOAA's findings have been?
It's a very important issue that our agency is looking at. I'm happy to report we've got some of the leading researchers in the world, Dr. Richard Feely, who just recently published a paper pointing out some of the observations that indicate that the oceans indeed are acidifying, and the projections with continued increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are for those increases to, we've gone up about 1/10 in pH, another not a tenth of a unit, another 1/10 to 2/10 of a units with the kinds of concentrations as projected by IPCC.
Thank you. We'll turn to Mr. Stearns of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lord Monckton, let me just give you a hypothetical question here that you might help me with.
Sir.
In mitigation, that is the elimination of CO2, let's say, for example, the United States adopted cap and trade as well as all the other methods to totally eliminate energy producing components that have CO2 emissions in this country. We totally eliminate it. How long would it take theoretically to bring back the level of CO2 that we have in this country today if we were successful in eliminating it? Is there any studies or anybody that's done it state by state in the United States, for example, my home state, or is there any way to evaluate what the repercussions would be?
Let me start state by state. Yes, sir, the Science and Public Policy Institute publishes state-by-state surveys of what would happen to global temperatures if that state were to close down its emissions altogether and go back to the Stone Age without even the right to light a fire in your caves. And the effect on temperatures, is fair to say, on an individual state-by-state basis is negligible. If you were to close down the entire United States economy and go back to the Stone Age, then what would happen is that's going to take you a certain amount of time to do. As you reduce your production here, since your citizens will still require much the same in the way of goods and services as they had before, they will have to get them from overseas, from places like China and India, where, alas, emissions per unit of production are considerably higher, in some cases 3 or 4 times higher than they are here, and therefore the net effect of the United States shutting down her economy would be to increase carbon emissions worldwide, achieving the very reverse of the objective which was, however piously, intended.
Are there any time frames you could say this study was done on, so you could say theoretically if we shut down, like say over the next 7 years before we would see the CO2 emissions come up to what they are?
You would see virtually no decline at all, because so quickly would other countries take up the production that you forego. If you transfer your jobs and your industries and your wealth to other countries and get them to do the work that was once done here, then the uptake and therefore the increase in CO2 emissions will be more or less immediate. All you'll be doing is shooting yourselves economically in the foot, not only for no climatic benefit whatsoever, but actually you'd end up making things worse, and you'd end up making things worse more or less immediately.
You've used that term, shooting ourselves in the foot. I think I'll use one of your assistants, sort of call this kneecap and tax, which would be shooting ourselves in the kneecap and then coming back and tax us and putting us in perilous condition. Mr. Waskoff, I have an article here that says biofuels pushing up food prices and poverty, Oxfam indicates. And so, you know, we have these well-intended mandates from ethanol. They are enacted supposedly to help the environment, and yet there seems to be consequences, reading this article. Shouldn't we be cautious in implementing any new policy which would have far-reaching effects such as a policy would change the entire energy base of our country, like kneecap and tax?
Well, I would say that it's absolutely the case that we need to be careful in designing a policy of this magnitude. I think that the consequences of climate change are so grave, particularly for poor people around the world and also in this country, that a lot of the care that must go into it is, in fact, making sure that emissions do not continue rising in a way that's going to lead to even greater harm down the road. And in the near term, since this hearing is focused on adaptation, I would just note that part of the care that we must take in designing climate policy is, in fact, to make sure that those who are being affected now by the current impacts of climate change are, in fact, having their needs met, and that the adaptation responses and the resilience responses that are necessary are, in fact, being put in place.
Would you state then that you think that we should scrap all biofuel targets in the world?
Well, if it's I mean, if the question goes to whether to entirely remove any policies supporting any kind of biofuels, that would not be our position. However, we do think that in the case of biofuels, because of the food consequences, that targets need to be looked at very closely in terms of how they may affect food supplies. And so corn ethanol is an excellent example where we have serious concerns about what it means to ramp up production of that because of the food consequences worldwide.
Do you have any percentages that you could use that ramped it up by? In other words, you talk about this biofuel mandates. Have they increased the global food prices by any percentage?
I'm not aware that we have a specific number that one can attribute to the increase. But
in the article, it says biofuels are responsible for 30% of the increase in global food prices, pushing 30 million people worldwide into poverty, the aid agency Oxfam said in a report Wednesday.
Yeah, I believe that is, I will check and happy to get back to you in writing. I believe that data reflects World Bank analysis of in their annual economic report last year.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Walden of Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kostiak, your predecessor at the hearing, Mr. Schweiger, made a comment that the boreal forests are either now or soon to be giving off more carbon than they're sequestering. And I wonder if you could speak to why that is.
Thank you. We are currently seeing a die-off of forests all around the globe, and it's due to the increased heat stress of rising average surface temperatures around the globe.
And would part of the effect of that be then additional drought conditions and stress on the trees themselves?
That is correct.
And so what is the proper intervention, if you're a forester, to help ameliorate that problem?
Well, a number of ideas have been suggested. There is no easy answer. Much more research will be needed to manage our way through this problem. Obviously, the first step is we need to cut global carbon emissions because we're not going to be able to adapt our way out of this problem.
So you don't think managing the forest back to a more balanced system is an answer?
No, that's where I was heading next. My point is that forest management by itself will not solve this problem. The first step will be to cut carbon emissions. We will not be able to address the massive die-offs of forests we're seeing around the globe unless we start there. The second will be to look at natural resources adaptation efforts, and that involves more scientific research. It involves storing as much groundwater as possible. It means forest management to reduce some of the fuel load to avoid unnecessary catastrophic fires.
I appreciate especially that last point. I represent a district of 70,000 square miles, 10 or 11 national forests. We've got forests there that are completely overstressed right now today. 500, the Wainema National Forest, there's about 500 square miles. The bugs have been eating away at for a decade. It is ready to explode. And yet there are many organizations who care passionately about global climate change and CO2 emissions reductions that consistently, repeatedly, and aggressively appeal every proposal to go in and do thinning operations on these forests to get them back into balance with nature, frankly, because you can let them get back in balance a couple of ways. You can let catastrophic fire just wipe out the stand, or we can go in and using, and I think there's a pretty good basis of scientific knowledge on the number of trees per acre that would be historically correct. And yet the same organizations are opposing it. So I guess my question is, and Mr. Moncton, you want to, Lord Moncton, I'm sorry, maybe you want to speak to this as well. I know we sort of have this existing exchange policy in the world where we don't manage our federal forests in America. We'd rather rape and pillage forests around the globe for our wood. And I'm not exaggerating here. I mean, 60%, I think, of Oregon's forest land is federal, and it represents 6% of the trees that are actually harvested. I got counties that are at 19.7% unemployment. These folks, I was just out there, they don't understand why the forests are allowed to burn up around them and they can't even burn dead trees while they still have value. And what they further don't understand is that their heating bills are going to go up dramatically under cap and trade. And the one manufacturer that's kind of left in Eastern Oregon makes cement, the Ash Grove cement plant, and they figure they probably have to close. Now, I don't know how this helps people in poverty.
Sir, I sympathize with you entirely. The one thing you don't want to do in the present economic circumstances is start closing down the few industries that still remain in the name of this chimera of global warming, which visibly hasn't been happening for the last 7 years, though it has been happening for the last 300, during at least 270 of which we could not have had anything to do about it. As for the management of trees, you are quite right. It is essential that proper fire breaks be cleared and maintained so as to prevent forest fires. Forest fires are not new. They're not a consequence of global warming. They occur naturally. They are, in fact, part of the natural process by which forests manage themselves. But if one wishes to minimize that, you must have fire breaks, and that's what we do in the UK.
Plus, we're finding that even the old-growth trees now are getting stressed because some years of drought. When they get stressed, then the bugs come in and they kill the old growth trees, which many people would like to preserve. So it really is a problem. Let me shift gears because I only have 30 seconds left. My district also is home to some of the most active wind energy development out there, and our grid in the Northwest will soon have more wind on it than any other grid by percentage in the country. The question has recently come up by some groups that and I thought this had been resolved, that wind energy and the wind turbines are killing raptors and birds. And so I would go to the the Wildlife Federation. Is that the view of your organization, that the wind energy we're putting in is, I thought they'd designed around this problem?
There are some negative impacts on wildlife from wind energy development. With that being said, these problems can be worked out. There are technical solutions. I mean, let's recognize, first of all, just installing the wind power by itself will take out some habitat. And then there are some collisions we're going to need to address, both with birds and bats. We are very much supportive of building out a massive wind energy complex. And it's a fundamental to the solution to global warming. This goes to our overall message here today. I mean, we're going to need to have a major investment in natural resources adaptation. And that it means a lot of public outreach so people can understand some of these trade-offs. There is no free energy source.
No.
And so we're going to have to find ways to minimize wind impacts. There are ways to place these renewable energy systems in the most degraded areas, or areas where there's already an extension of human footprint, and trying to protect those pristine areas. But at the same time, we have to get this wind energy development built, this wind energy complex built.
But at the end of the day, you kind of have to put it where the wind is.
That's one of the key factors to look at, yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. My time's run out, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. I appreciate your testimony from all of you.
Thank you. With the unanimous consent, the chair will put into the record a letter dated March 24th, 2009 from the Outdoor Industry Association, and another one from a group of organizations, including the League of Women Voters, dated March 25th, 2009. I would extend an opportunity to any of you who feel a burning passion to make another one-minute statement on anything you didn't have a chance to say. We want to make sure the witnesses have a chance to respond to any of the questions you were asked. If any of you would like to take a minute to extend your comments, feel free to do so. Mr. Carl, would you like to? Don't feel compelled, by the way.
No, I don't. I just wanted
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Certainly.
Does that mean we get a chance for a 1-minute response to their 1-minute question?
If Mr. Shimkus would like, I would certainly.
I mean, I'm just trying to find out the rules here.
I would be happy to extend a minute to Mr. Shimkus for sure, if that's so ordered by the two consensus builders of Shimkus and Inslee. Mr. Carl.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the committee for addressing this extremely important issue, and note that there is an enormous amount of climate change science that is available today. A major challenge for our agency, which we hope to be able to address in the short few years ahead, is to take that science and make it available to help make decisions, practical decisions that are required from a local scale all the way up to national and international scales. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson.
I would parrot that, but I think we have an information shortage here, especially at the local level, such that we're not prepared to make economic decisions yet. We need the data first before we can do the cost-benefit trade-offs on what's going to be worth the investment and what's not. And the same is true with the cap-and-trade bill. It depends upon the way you design it, how expensive or not it's going to be, and whether the benefits are worth the cost. So I just don't think we're there yet. I think we need to negotiate the specific details of any legislation and see what that means before we can say universally that it's going to cost jobs and tank the economy.
Mr. Koistak?
Mr. Inslee, thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity. Very much want to associate myself with my colleagues' remarks about the need for additional scientific research. If you look at the overall agenda for natural resources adaptation, we have to recognize, first of all, we're playing major catch-up on the scientific research here. There's been a lot of investment on the mitigation side. We're really just getting going on adaptation. That being said, there are many, many things that the scientists already agree on that are essentially no-regret strategies for making our natural systems more resilient to the harmful impacts of climate change. And we've heard some of them today, whether it's buffering people and wildlife from coastal storms by rebuilding wetlands complex. We should be doing those now. The longer we wait, the more difficult and expensive it gets. And so when we came here today and advocated for a very substantial, large-scale investment in natural resources adaptation as part of climate change, this is something we can demonstrate today has far greater economic benefits than the cost, and there's no reason to hesitate.
Thank you. Dr. Bresner?
I would just simply ask the members of the committee to study very carefully the results of the findings of the Copenhagen Consensus, which attempts to rank a variety of different responses to climate change, assuming the IPCC's scenarios to be accurate, ranks the variety of different responses and responses to other problems pressing upon mankind. We don't have infinite resources. There are opportunity costs. And I think there are things that need to take much higher priority than anything we can do in either mitigation or adaptation in response to climate.
Lord Monckton?
Thank you, sir. Don't do cap and trade. Remember the poor. Remember your taxpayers. Beware rent seekers, particularly from the scientific community. Remember the warning of Eisenhower against the technocrats who would eventually take over and try to push you in various directions. Pay no attention. Keep your spending down as a state and as a nation, and God bless you all.
Mr. Wasco?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address two things quickly. First of all, on the Katrina issue, I would agree that there was a massive failure of the levees. There was also a failure of the emergency response system. But I think what the lesson that we should draw from this is what is necessary in the context of increasing risk from climate change. And as we have increasing risk, on the one hand, we also have to have resilience and adaptive strategies on the other hand going together. And so dealing with the levees is not, or our emergency response system, is not something separate and apart from addressing climate change. It should be integrated, and it should be integrated as well with a dramatic reduction in emissions. The second thing I just wanted to quickly address is the question of renewable energy in developing countries. And without getting into detail, just to say that our view is that renewable energy does in fact have many benefits in the development context, and often, in fact, renewable energy is what is going to be necessary for the poorest around the world to be able to have access to modern energy sources.
Thank you. Bishop?
Thank you very much. I thought it was very aptly put earlier by Mr. Shimkus that God has no intention of destroying what he has created. He has placed upon us, in addition to that, a covenant that we must honor with him, but also with one another in the care of the earth. This is part of our responsibility as good stewards. it's also part of our responsibility to care for one another as we do this. There are others who are affected by what's going on with the changes in the climate and have no way of dealing with it in a way that's life-sustaining or capacity-building. We're committed to doing that and continuing that work, and call upon Congress at this time not only to carry out its traditional responsibilities as well as it has in the past, but also to take leadership in thinking for those of us and to advocate for those of us who cannot speak for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Shimkus, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, to assume that man can control the world's climate is a very dangerous and very arrogant position. It reminds me of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, when man thought they could build a tower to reach God. It was in their arrogance that they thought they could do things that only God can do. What hasn't been talked about a lot, I think the impact on the poor has been talked about, the rural areas, the job dislocation. I think we've ferreted that out. What I would ask you all to look at is especially that climate cap and trade, cap and tax, this trading floor. Numerous times my colleagues on the other side have attacked the New York Mercantile Exchange. Farmers have always attacked the Chicago Board of Trade, because big money interests go into these, and it's an area for big money to make big money by setting the price for carbon on a trading floor. They will be held accountable when they attack the trading floor venue, as they always do in this failed policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. If you'd like to make a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First point out, the National Hurricane Center actually tracks hurricanes over the last 150 or so years, and you might not be able to see this where you're sitting, but there have actually been periods going back over 100 years where there were higher numbers of hurricanes and bigger hurricanes than Hurricane Katrina, but clearly the devastation that was caused from Katrina and the deaths related to it were caused by, number one, failure of federal levees, but also the erosion of the coast, none of which has anything to do with changing in climate temperatures. And clearly, I think the science on global change is not settled. One thing that is settled is the cost to this country. Peter Orszag, President Obama's own budget director, stated before this committee that this type of policy, cap and trade policy, an energy tax, would actually cost every American family over $1,300 a year in increased energy costs that they would be paying. Now, for those people that think people making below $250,000 a year won't pay a dime, you give them that $1,300 bill, you're going to have a hard time explaining it to them. That one area is settled as a result of this policy that we should defeat, and I yield back.
Thank you. I just would like to point out we have one of our witnesses from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and I would just suggest that fulfilling our stewardship responsibility does not involve destroying all creatures great and small. The Lord God made them all, and in fact that's what's going on right now. And I don't think we can help the polar bear adopt. They're gone unless something changes in our climate policy. I don't think the people of Shishmaref can have a problem. Their city in Alaska is melting in the sea. We can't just tell them they just kind of have to pick up and move to Florida. It's just not their cup of tea, and it's not our right to make them move. And I would suggest that we appreciate wisdom from all over the country, but the Englishman I will be listening to is Sir Isaac Newton, whose physical laws are quite well accepted, as is the science, on everything we've been talking about here today. Thank you very much.
Until Einstein.
The last word.